Diane Abbott has been suspended from the Labour Party again.
You got into terrible trouble for a letter you wrote to the Observer about racism. And you appeared to suggest, in the view of some of your critics anyway, that the kind of anti-Semitism that the Jewish community suffered, or travellers suffered, or Irish people suffered, was somehow different from the racism that you as a young black person had suffered. You were suspended and there was a great hoo-ha. Do you look back on that with regret?
No, not at all. Clearly, there must be a difference between racism, which is about colour, and other types of racism, because you can see a traveller or a Jewish person walking down the street. You don't know. You don't know unless you stop to speak to them or you're in a meeting with them. But if you see a black person walking down the street, you see straight away that they're black. They are different types of racism.
So those comments were made in an interview with the BBC. It was recorded, I think, much earlier this year, actually, but just published this week or published yesterday. Diane Abbott was immediately re-suspended. It's a difficult one. I mean, obviously, she shouldn't have been suspended. But in terms of what was said in that interview, everything she said about different types of racism, I think, is entirely correct. Of course, racism is different depending on whether a stranger can tell you're of a different race, right? A black person is racialized a lot more often than a Jewish person when they're walking down the street. I think that's just obviously true. And that means it will come with different challenges. I think the mistake was to say she had no regrets about the original letter she sent to the Observer, which did go further than saying different types of racisms are different. This is her full letter, just to remind you. So it said, Tamiwa Owolade claims that Irish, Jewish and traveller people all suffer from racism. So this was in response to an article by him. They undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism, and the two words are often used as if they are interchangeable. It is true that many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice, but they are not all their lives subject to racism. In pre-civil rights America, Irish people, Jewish people and travellers were not required to sit at the back of the bus. In apartheid South Africa, these groups were allowed to vote. And at the height of slavery, there were no white-seeming people manacled on the slave ships. I mean, as we said at the time, again, I don't think she should have been suspended for it, but a number of things wrong with that letter. I suppose because in this letter, she's saying that Jewish people, Irish people and traveller people don't suffer from racism, essentially. She's saying they suffer from prejudice, which she compares to prejudice against redheads. I also think it's strange to give a sort of brief potted history of racism in the 20th century and before the 20th century, because she's talking about the height of slavery, but miss out the Holocaust, which is obviously a large event of industrial racism, or racism on an industrial scale. So to miss that out and sort of suggest that all the material forms of racism are against people based on their skin color, it was a bad letter. Basically, it was a bad letter. I think everything she said in that interview, on the face of it, was fine, but I don't know why she said she had no regrets about a letter, which she went on to apologise for anyway. I suppose it's difficult to read people's minds, isn't it? Whatever the case, though, I think Keir Starmer is just suspending people willy-nilly very easily. And the discourse around all this does drive me up the wall. For example, this was Robert Peston on ITV News.
She basically said she had no regrets, and she continued to repeat this idea that somehow, she would say the lived experience as a black person of racism is different, for example, from the racism that somebody like me who's a Jew would have experienced. Now, most people would say you should never say that there's a hierarchy of racism, and that the implication of what she said is that there's a hierarchy. I'm sure she would deny that that's what she meant, but that's what came across, and that's why the Labour Party has suspended her again.
Maybe I'm being unfair here, but just watching that and seeing Robert Peston, who most people, I did know he was Jewish actually, but only sort of after he hosted a Jewish Labour movement hustings or something along those lines, right? I don't think that throughout his career he will have been particularly read as anything other than a white guy in the media, right? One of the most powerful journalists in the country saying, essentially, how dare Diane Abbott, the most abused politician in the country, say that the racism she's experienced is different from the racism I've experienced. Like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's received lots of, credible death threats because of his Jewish background. Clearly, there's a lot of violent racism in his family history. I think he's got ancestors or relatives who died in the Holocaust, right? But the idea that his life experience and Diane Abbott's life experience can be sort of meaningfully compared and say that their experience of racism is basically the same. When to most people walking down the street, Robert Peston is a white guy, right? A white guy in a very dominant position in the media. Like, I just don't think his experience of racism will be remotely similar to Diane Abbott. So to sort of do all this hand-wringing, most people will think it's outrageous that Diane Abbott has suggested that her experience of racism might be different from my experience of racism, me, Robert Peston. I really think most people watching that will think, I thought Robert Peston experiences racism, really? I mean, I'm not saying he hasn't. Maybe he has, right? But I think this idea that what Diane Abbott said in the second interview, as I say, I think the original letter, which she said, the original letter was silly, was wrong. Saying she didn't regret it was stupid, I think. But everyone's sort of wringing their hands saying, how dare you say that the racism faced by black people is different to the racism faced by someone like Robert Peston, I just think is somewhat discrediting.